What happens when a single moment of crisis strips away the carefully constructed walls between two worlds? When a mother's instinct transcends every boundary of class, wealth, and social standing? For Michael Harrison, CEO of Harrison Technologies and master of his own universe, that moment came on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening when he discovered his housekeeper cradling his unconscious son in her arms, blood streaming down the boy's face, her voice whispering words that would shatter everything he thought he knew about the woman who had cleaned his home for 3 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Harrison mansion stood like a fortress against the Seattle skyline, its glass and steel architecture a testament to the fortune built on cutting-edge software solutions. 28 rooms spread across 12,000 square feet, each space meticulously designed to project power, success, and an almost clinical perfection. It was a home where every surface gleamed, where silence was golden, and where the only sounds that mattered were the ones that made money. Michael Harrison had built this empire from nothing. At 42, he was the kind of man whose presence commanded attention without effort. Tall, sharp-featured, with steel-grey eyes that missed nothing, he moved through his world with the confidence of someone who had never met a problem he couldn't solve or a competitor he couldn't crush. His suits were hand-tailored, his schedule managed to the minute, and his emotions kept under lock and key. Control was his religion, and success was his god. The only crack in his perfectly ordered existence was his 8-year-old son, David. The boy was a living reminder of the one failure Michael couldn't fix or forget. David's mother, Rebecca, had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, leaving Michael to navigate single parenthood with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to hostile takeovers. He loved his son fiercely, but in the distant, protective way of a man who had learned early that emotions were weaknesses to be exploited. David was everything Michael was not. Where his father was controlled, David was spontaneous. Where Michael spoke in measured corporate tones, David laughed with abandon. The boy had his mother's warm brown eyes and infectious smile, qualities that both delighted and terrified his father. Michael saw Rebecca in every gesture, every expression, and the resemblance was a daily reminder of what he had lost. Their relationship existed in careful, structured moments, breakfast meetings where they discussed David's school performance like quarterly reports, weekend activities planned with military precision, birthday parties that resembled corporate events more than childhood celebrations. Michael told himself this was stability, that routine and discipline were what David needed. Deep down, he feared that any show of vulnerability would somehow invite more loss into their lives. The staff who maintained the Harrison household moved through their duties with the same quiet efficiency their employer demanded. The head housekeeper, Maria Santos, had been with the family for 3 years, arriving 6 months after Rebecca's death when Michael finally admitted he couldn't manage both an empire and a household. She was 34, originally from El Salvador, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. Maria was invisible in the way that domestic workers often are to the wealthy. She arrived each morning at 6, prepared breakfast, cleaned the vast spaces, did laundry, and disappeared into the background of their lives. Michael knew her first name, paid her well, and occasionally acknowledged her presence with a nod. He knew nothing about her life beyond the walls of his home, and he preferred it that way. Emotional distance was safer for everyone. What Michael didn't know was that Maria Santos carried secrets that ran deeper than the polished floors she walked across each day. Every morning when she entered the Harrison mansion, she was stepping into a world that reminded her of everything she had lost and everything she could never reclaim. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her days caring for a child who had everything, while somewhere in the world, her own daughter remained forever out of reach. 15 years earlier, Maria had been someone else entirely. She had been Dr. Maria Elena Vasquez, a pediatric surgeon at Hospital Nacional in San Salvador, one of the most respected medical professionals in the country. She had graduated summa cum laude from medical school, completed her residency in the United States, and returned home with dreams of building a world-class children's medical center. She had been married to Carlos, a fellow doctor, and they had a beautiful 2-year-old daughter named Isabella. The civil unrest that swept through El Salvador in the early 2000s changed everything. Drug cartels and corrupt government officials created a web of violence that touched every level of society. Maria's hospital became a target when she began treating victims of cartel violence, refusing to turn away patients based on their political affiliations or ability to pay. Her husband Carlos had been more cautious, warning her that their visibility was dangerous, but Maria believed medicine should transcend politics. The night that destroyed her life came without warning. Armed men stormed their home searching for evidence that Carlos was providing medical care to anti-government rebels. It was a case of mistaken identity, a confusion of names that would prove fatal. In the chaos that followed, Carlos was shot while trying to protect their daughter. Maria watched her husband die in her arms, his blood staining the floors of their bedroom while little Isabella screamed in terror from her crib. The attack was meant to send a message, but Maria had become a liability. Government forces allied with the cartels couldn't allow a prominent doctor who had witnessed their brutality to continue practicing. They gave her a choice: disappear or join her husband. She had 48 hours to leave the country, and she could take nothing with her except what fit in a single bag. The most devastating part was Isabella. Maria's sister Carmen, who lived in a remote village, agreed to care for the child temporarily. Maria convinced herself it would only be for a few months, that she would find a way to establish herself in the United States and then bring Isabella north. She kissed her daughter goodbye, promising to return soon, and climbed into the back of a truck that would take her to the Mexican border. The journey north was a nightmare of hidden compartments, dangerous river crossings, and constant fear of discovery. By the time Maria reached Los Angeles, she was physically and emotionally broken. Her medical credentials meant nothing without the proper documentation, and her illegal status made practicing medicine impossible. She couldn't even use her real name safely, adopting the identity of Maria Santos from documents provided by a coyote who had helped her cross the border. For months she cleaned offices at night and worked in restaurant kitchens during the day, sending every dollar she could spare back to Carmen for Isabella's care. She applied for asylum, telling her story to immigration lawyers who warned her that cases like hers took years to resolve. Meanwhile, the violence in El Salvador escalated. Phone calls to Carmen became increasingly dangerous, and eventually they stopped altogether. 3 years into her exile, Maria received the news that shattered what remained of her heart. Carmen's village had been attacked by paramilitaries searching for rebel sympathizers. Most of the residents fled to refugee camps, but in the chaos, children became separated from their families. Isabella, now 5 years old, had disappeared. Carmen had searched everywhere, but the little girl was nowhere to be found. Maria tried desperately to return to El Salvador to search for her daughter, but immigration authorities detained her at the airport. Her asylum case was still pending, and leaving the country would have meant permanent exile. She was trapped in a bureaucratic purgatory, unable to search for Isabella, and unable to return to the only life she had ever known. Years passed in a haze of grief and desperate hope. Maria checked missing children databases, contacted humanitarian organizations, and sent money to private investigators who promised results they couldn't deliver. Every lead turned cold, every hope was dashed. Isabella would be 20 now if she was still alive. The little girl who had called her Mommy and fallen asleep in her arms might not even remember her face. The work as a housekeeper had come through an agency that specialized in placing domestic workers with wealthy families. Maria's references were fabricated. Her background check showed nothing more than a quiet woman who needed work, and her gentle manner with children made her an ideal candidate for families with young ones. The Harrison family was her third placement, and by far the most challenging. Working in the Harrison mansion was like walking through a museum of everything she had lost. The casual wealth that surrounded her, The way Michael Harrison took his son's presence for granted, the expensive toys that David barely noticed, it all served as a constant reminder of the daughter she couldn't find and the life she couldn't reclaim. Yet she stayed, because caring for David filled a void in her heart that nothing else could touch. David Harrison was drawn to Maria in ways his father couldn't understand. While Michael's interactions with his son were formal and scheduled, Maria's were warm and spontaneous. She listened when David talked about his day at school, helped with homework without making it feel like a business meeting, and noticed when he was sad or worried. She didn't replace his mother, but she provided something his father couldn't: emotional availability. The boy began seeking out Maria during her work hours, asking questions about her homeland and sharing stories about his friends at school. She taught him simple Spanish phrases, and he taught her about his video games. These interactions happened in the margins of the Harrison household, brief moments between her cleaning duties that neither she nor David mentioned to Michael. They both sensed, without discussing it, that these conversations belonged to them. Michael noticed his son's improved mood and better behavior, but attributed it to the stability of routine rather than his connection with the housekeeper. In his world, staff were meant to be functionally invisible, and he genuinely didn't see the small kindnesses Maria showed David or the way the boy's face lit up when she entered a room. His emotional blind spots, developed as protective mechanisms after Rebecca's death, prevented him from recognizing the relationship forming under his own roof. The Harrison household existed in this delicate balance for 3 years. Michael focused on building his business empire. David navigated childhood with the help of an increasingly important maternal figure he couldn't name. And Maria poured her frustrated parental love into caring for a boy who reminded her daily of what she had lost. Each of them carried secrets and pain, but the routine of their shared space provided a kind of comfort that none of them fully acknowledged. The events that would shatter this careful equilibrium began on an ordinary Tuesday in November. Seattle's notorious rain had been falling steadily for 3 days, turning the world into shades of gray and silver. Michael was in his home office, participating in a conference call with investors in Tokyo, when he heard the sound that would change everything: a scream of pure terror followed by a sickening crash from somewhere in the house. David had been playing in the upstairs hallway, racing his remote-controlled car along the polished hardwood floors, while Maria worked in the nearby bedrooms. The hallway was long and straight, perfect for testing the car's speed, but it ended at a large window that overlooked the mansion's front circular drive. David had played this game dozens of times before, always stopping the car before it reached the window. On this particular afternoon, the car's remote control malfunctioned. Instead of stopping when David pressed the brake button, the vehicle accelerated directly toward the window. In his panic to catch it, David ran at full speed down the hallway, his sock-covered feet sliding on the smooth floor. He reached for the car just as it struck the window, and his momentum carried him forward into the glass. The window was made of safety glass, designed to crack rather than shatter into dangerous shards, but the impact was still devastating. David's head struck the window with tremendous force, spider-webbing the glass and sending him tumbling backward onto the hardwood floor. Blood immediately began streaming from a gash on his forehead, and the boy lay motionless, his small body alarmingly still. Maria heard the crash from the master bedroom where she was changing sheets. The sound was followed by a silence that every parent recognizes as wrong, the absence of crying or movement that signals genuine emergency. She dropped the linens and ran toward the hallway, her heart already racing with dread. The scene that greeted her was every caregiver's nightmare. David lay crumpled against the base of the cracked window, blood pooling beneath his head, his face pale, and his breathing shallow. For a split second, Maria saw not David Harrison but Isabella, her own daughter as she had last seen her, small and vulnerable and needing her protection. Every instinct she had suppressed for 15 years roared to life. This wasn't the housekeeper Maria Santos seeing an injured child. This was Dr. Maria Elena Vasquez confronting a pediatric emergency, and her medical training overrode every other consideration. She dropped to her knees beside David, her hands automatically moving to check his pulse and assess his breathing while her eyes examined the head wound. The gash was deep but not life-threatening if treated properly. More concerning was the possibility of a concussion or skull fracture from the impact. David was unconscious but breathing steadily, his pulse strong but rapid. Maria knew she needed to keep him still to prevent further injury, but she also knew that time was critical if there was internal bleeding or swelling in his brain. Without hesitation, she scooped David into her arms, cradling his head against her chest to support his neck and spine. Her movements were precise and confident, the muscle memory of years spent handling injured children in emergency situations. She applied pressure to the head wound with one hand while supporting his body with the other, whispering reassurances in Spanish that came from the deepest part of her heart. "Está bien, mi niño," she murmured, her voice breaking with an emotion that surprised her. "Todo va estar bien, no tengas miedo." The words were meant for David, but they carried the weight of everything she had never been able to say to Isabella, every comfort she had been unable to provide her own child. As she held David, feeling his small heart beating against her chest, Maria experienced a moment of profound recognition. This was what she had been put on earth to do. Not cleaning houses or staying invisible, but protecting children, healing them, being present in moments when they needed her most. For the first time in 15 years, she felt like herself again. Michael's conference call was interrupted by sounds from upstairs that didn't belong in his carefully ordered world. The crash had been loud enough to hear through his office door, but it was the quality of silence that followed that made him excuse himself from the call and investigate. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, following an instinct he couldn't name. The sight that greeted him at the top of the stairs stopped him cold. His housekeeper, the quiet woman who had been virtually invisible for 3 years, was kneeling in a pool of blood, holding his unconscious son with a competence and tenderness that seemed to transform her into someone else entirely. The cracked window behind them told the story of the accident, but what struck Michael wasn't the damage or even his son's injuries. It was the way Maria held David, her body curved protectively around the boy, her movements precise and sure, her voice a soft murmur of words he couldn't understand, but whose meaning was unmistakable. This wasn't panic or confusion. This was someone who knew exactly what she was doing, someone who had held injured children before, someone whose instincts ran deeper than job descriptions or household duties. "What happened?" Michael demanded, his own panic making his voice sharper than he intended. Maria looked up at him, and for the first time in 3 years he really saw her. Her eyes weren't the deferential gaze of hired help. They were the eyes of someone in complete control of an emergency, someone who knew things he didn't, someone who was already 3 steps ahead of him in caring for his son. "He hit the window," she said, her accent thicker than usual with stress but her voice steady. "We need to get him to a hospital immediately. He may have a concussion, and this cut needs stitches." The authority in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't a suggestion from an employee. This was a directive from someone who knew what she was talking about. Michael felt a strange disorientation, as if he had walked into his own home and discovered it was someone else's house entirely. "I'll call 911, he said, pulling out his phone. "No time," Maria replied, already rising to her feet with David still in her arms. "Seattle Children's Hospital is 10 minutes away if we drive. An ambulance will take twice that long to get here, and then transport him. Every minute matters with head injuries." Michael stared at her. In 3 years he had never heard Maria speak more than a few words at a time. She had never offered opinions, never questioned his decisions, never displayed anything resembling medical knowledge. Yet here she was, making life or death decisions about his son with the confidence of someone who had done this before. "How do you know all this?" he asked,
even as he grabbed his car keys. Maria was already moving toward the stairs, David secure in her arms. "I just do," she said. "We need to go now." The drive to Seattle Children's Hospital was the longest 10 minutes of Michael's life. Maria sat in the back seat, continuing to monitor David's breathing and pulse while maintaining pressure on his head wound. She spoke to the unconscious boy in Spanish, her voice soft and soothing, and Michael found himself straining to understand words that sounded like prayers. "His breathing is stable," Maria reported without being asked. "Pulse is elevated but strong."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The bleeding has slowed significantly. These are good signs. How do you know what to look for? Michael asked again, his eyes meeting hers in the rearview mirror. There was a long pause before Maria answered. "I used to work in a medical clinic," she said finally. "Before I came here, it was the first personal information she had ever volunteered about her life before the Harrison household, and Michael sensed there was much more she wasn't saying. The way she held David, the medical terminology she used, the confidence with which she had taken charge of the situation. None of it matched the profile of someone who had simply worked in a clinic. At the hospital, Maria carried David through the emergency room doors like she owned the place. She approached the triage nurse with the same authority she had displayed at home, rattling off David's vital signs, the nature of his injuries, and the timeline of the accident with precision that made the medical staff take immediate notice. "Room 3, the nurse said, grabbing a wheelchair. "Doctor will see him right away." "No wheelchair," Maria said firmly. "He needs to remain still. Possible spinal injury from the fall." The nurse looked surprised but nodded, gesturing for Maria to carry David directly into the examination room. Michael followed, feeling strangely like a visitor in his own son's medical emergency. The woman he had barely noticed for 3 years had somehow become the primary caregiver, and everyone around them seemed to accept her authority without question. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the attending physician, was a woman in her 50s with the brisk efficiency of someone who dealt with pediatric emergencies every day. She took one look at the way Maria was holding David and immediately understood she was dealing with someone who knew what she was doing. "You can place him on the examination table," Dr. Walsh said. "Nice work stabilizing his neck during transport." Maria carefully transferred David to the table, her movements smooth and professional. She stepped back to give the doctor room to work, but remained close enough to monitor everything that was happening. Michael noticed that she wasn't watching as a concerned household employee. She was observing like a colleague, tracking the doctor's examination techniques and nodding slightly at diagnostic decisions. "Pulse ox looks good," Dr. Walsh murmured, attaching monitors to David's small body. "Pupils are responsive, good signs for avoiding serious brain injury." As the doctor worked, she asked Maria questions about the accident, David's medical history, and his current medications. Michael realized with a start that Maria knew more about his son's health than he did. She rattled off vaccination dates, previous injuries, and even details about David's birth that Michael had forgotten or never known. "Are you his mother?" Dr. Walsh asked, glancing between Maria and Michael. "No," Maria said quietly. I care for him." Something in her voice made Michael look at her more closely. There was a pain in her expression that went far beyond concern for an injured child in her care. It was the look of someone who understood exactly what it meant to lose a child, someone who had lived that nightmare and couldn't bear to see it happen again. The next hour passed in a blur of X-rays, Connecticut scans, and careful monitoring. David regained consciousness gradually, confused and frightened, but neurologically intact. The head wound required 12 stitches, and he would need to be monitored for signs of concussion, but Dr. Walsh assured them that he would make a full recovery. Throughout the entire process, Maria remained by David's side, holding his hand during procedures and translating the doctor's explanations into words the 8-year-old could understand. She seemed to anticipate his needs before he voiced them, adjusting his pillow, getting him ice chips, and providing the kind of intuitive care that comes only from deep experience with children. Michael watched this transformation with growing amazement and unease. The woman he thought he knew, the quiet housekeeper who cleaned his home and prepared his meals, was clearly someone else entirely. The way she moved in the medical environment, the confidence with which she handled David's care, the depth of knowledge she displayed, none of it fit with the story he had constructed about her life. As they prepared to take David home, Dr. Walsh pulled Michael aside. "You're very fortunate," she said. "Whoever that woman is, she probably saved your son from much more serious injury." Her immediate response and the way she handled the transport was textbook perfect. "Does she have medical training?" Michael realized he didn't know how to answer that question. After 3 years of employing Maria Santos, he knew virtually nothing about her background, her education, or her life before she knocked on his door looking for work. He had been content to remain ignorant, to keep her safely categorized as the help, but the events of this day had shattered those comfortable assumptions. "I'm not sure," he admitted. Dr. Walsh looked surprised. "Well, I'd be curious to know. She handled this emergency better than some paramedics I've worked with." The ride home was quiet, except for David's occasional complaints about his headache and the uncomfortable bandage on his forehead. Maria sat in the back seat with him again, monitoring his condition and providing comfort, while Michael drove and tried to process what he had witnessed. By the time they reached the mansion, David was alert enough to walk on his own, though Maria stayed close beside him. She helped him up to his room, got him settled in bed with his favorite stuffed animal, and brought him soup and crackers for dinner. Michael watched these interactions from the doorway, seeing them with completely new eyes. This wasn't just competent childcare. This was love. Pure, deep, maternal love that went far beyond professional duty or even personal affection. Maria cared for David the way she would care for her own child, with a tenderness and devotion that couldn't be faked or hired. The question that haunted Michael was why. That evening, after David was asleep and the immediate crisis had passed, Michael found himself in the unusual position of wanting to talk to his housekeeper. He had never had a personal conversation with Maria, never asked about her life or shown interest in anything beyond her work performance. But the woman who had taken charge of his son's emergency was clearly not the woman he thought he had been employing. He found her in the kitchen, cleaning up from the day's chaos. She was back to her usual quiet efficiency, but Michael could see the exhaustion in her shoulders and the emotional toll the day had taken on her face. For the first time, he noticed the lines around her eyes, the premature aging that comes from carrying heavy burdens, the sadness that seemed to be her constant companion. "Maria," he said, and she looked up with surprise. He rarely addressed her directly, and never by name. "Yes, Mr. Harrison. I want to thank you for what you did today. David could have been much more seriously hurt if you hadn't known how to handle the situation." She nodded but didn't meet his eyes. "I'm glad he's going to be okay." Michael hesitated, unsure how to ask the questions that were burning in his mind. "Dr. Walsh seemed to think you have medical training. More than just working in a clinic." The silence stretched between them, and Michael could see Maria weighing how much truth she could afford to reveal. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was a doctor," she said. "Before I came to this country, I was a pediatric surgeon." The words hit Michael like a physical blow. A pediatric surgeon, not a clinic worker, not someone with basic first aid training, but a specialist in operating on children. Someone who had spent years learning to save young lives, someone whose hands were trained to heal rather than clean. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. though even as the words left his mouth, he realized how naive the question was. Maria's immigration status, her inability to practice medicine legally, the complex web of barriers that kept skilled immigrants working in jobs far below their qualifications, it was a story as old as America itself. "It doesn't matter what I used to be," Maria said, turning back to her cleaning. "This is who I am now." But Michael could see that it did matter. The way she had transformed during David's emergency, the competence and authority that had emerged when a child needed her skills, that was who she really was, underneath the invisible uniform of domestic service. She was a healer forced to hide her gifts, a professional reduced to menial labor, a woman whose true identity had been buried beneath the necessities of survival. The realization changed something fundamental in Michael's understanding of his household and his life. For 3 years, he had unknowingly employed one of the most qualified child-care providers in the city, while treating her as barely more than furniture. A woman who could have been saving children's lives was instead scrubbing his floors, and he had never bothered to learn enough about her to discover the truth. That night, Michael lay awake thinking about the day's events and the woman sleeping in the small apartment above his garage. He found himself wondering about her story, about what had brought a pediatric surgeon from Central America to work as his housekeeper, about what kind of loss or trauma had driven her so far from her calling. For the first time in years, his thoughts were focused on someone other than himself or his business empire. Meanwhile, in her small apartment, Maria sat by her window looking out at the city lights and thinking about David's pale face as he lay unconscious in her arms. The day had awakened feelings and memories she had spent years trying to suppress. Holding an injured child, using her medical skills to help rather than harm, being needed in the way she was trained to be needed, it had reminded her of who she used to be and who she might still be, if circumstances were different. She thought about Isabella, as she did every night, wondering if her daughter was safe somewhere in the world, wondering if someone had been there to care for her when she was hurt or frightened. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was pouring maternal love into caring for another woman's child, while her own daughter remained lost to her. But caring for David had become the closest thing to practicing medicine she had experienced in 15 years, and she couldn't bring herself to regret the emotional investment, even knowing it came with its own kind of pain. The accident had shifted something in the Harrison household, though none of them fully understood what yet. David would recover from his physical injuries quickly, but the emotional bonds forged in that moment of crisis would prove more lasting. Michael's eyes had been opened to the reality of the woman who shared his home, and Maria had been reminded of her own capacity for healing and love. What none of them knew was that this was only the beginning. The questions Michael was asking about Maria's background would lead him down a path that would uncover not just her professional qualifications, but the tragic circumstances that had brought her to his door. And Maria's decision to reveal even a small piece of her truth would set in motion events that would ultimately force her to confront the past she had been running from for 15 years. The story that began with a child's accident would become something much larger, a tale of lost identities, impossible choices, and the power of human connection to heal wounds that seemed permanent. But first there would be more questions, more revelations, and more decisions that would test the fragile trust beginning to form between a man who controlled everything and a woman who had lost everything that mattered most. The morning after David's accident brought an unusual quiet to the Harrison mansion. Michael had arranged to work from home, ostensibly to monitor his son's recovery, but in reality, he found himself unable to concentrate on anything except the woman moving through his house with the same efficient grace she had displayed for 3 years. Every interaction he witnessed between Maria and David now carried new weight, every gentle correction or encouraging word revealing layers of expertise he had been blind to. David, despite his bandaged forehead and mild headache, was in surprisingly good spirits.
The drama of his hospital visit had already transformed into an adventure story he was eager to share with his classmates. What struck Michael most was how naturally David turned to Maria for comfort and reassurance, seeking her out when the pain medication made him dizzy, asking her opinion about whether his stitches looked cool or gross. "Miss Maria," David said over breakfast using the formal address his father had taught him, "will you tell me again about the different kinds of doctors, the ones who fix kids like me?" Michael paused in his review of quarterly reports, listening as Maria patiently explained the various pediatric specialties, her knowledge far too detailed and current for someone whose medical experience was limited to working in a clinic. She spoke about surgical procedures with casual familiarity, mentioned hospital protocols with insider knowledge, and used terminology that most people would need to look up. "How do you know so much about brain surgery?" David asked with the directness only children possessed. Maria's hand stilled for a moment as she buttered his toast. "I read a lot of medical books," she said finally. "I find it interesting." It was a deflection Michael realized, technically true but designed to avoid deeper questions. He watched as she deftly changed the subject, asking David about his plans for the day, and reminding him that he needed to rest between activities. The conversation flowed naturally, but Michael could see the careful boundaries Maria maintained, the way she shared knowledge while concealing experience. Later that morning, Michael found himself doing something he had never done before, paying attention to Maria's daily routine. He observed her from his office window as she moved through the garden, deadheading flowers with the same precision she brought to everything else. Her movements were economical, purposeful, and he noticed she favored her right hand in a way that suggested old injury or strain. When she thought no one was watching, her shoulders sagged with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. The breakthrough came when David's pediatrician, Dr. Rachel Kim, arrived for a follow-up house call. Michael had requested the visit partly for David's care, and partly because he wanted to observe how Maria interacted with another medical professional. What he witnessed exceeded his expectations and raised entirely new questions. Dr. Kim was examining David's stitches when she made a casual comment about the quality of the initial wound care. "Whoever cleaned and dressed this did excellent work," she said. "Very professional technique. Was this done at the hospital?" "Maria did it," David announced proudly. "She knew exactly what to do. She was like a real doctor." Dr. Kim looked up with interest, her gaze finding Maria, who was organizing David's medications with practiced efficiency. "You have medical training?" the doctor asked directly. Maria's response was careful, measured, some experience with first aid and emergency care, but Dr. Kim wasn't satisfied with the vague answer. As a pediatrician who worked with children from diverse backgrounds, she had encountered many immigrants whose credentials didn't transfer, whose stories involved dramatic career changes necessitated by circumstances beyond their control. Something in Maria's demeanor triggered her professional curiosity. "The way you handled the initial stabilization," Dr. Kim pressed gently, "the positioning, the pressure points, the decision to transport rather than wait for an ambulance, that's not first aid training."
That's advanced trauma management. Michael watched Maria's face carefully. He could see her internal struggle, the weighing of options, the calculation of risks. Finally, she made a decision that would change everything. "I was trained as a surgeon," Maria admitted quietly, "in El Salvador, many years ago." Dr. Kim's eyebrows raised. "What type of surgery?" "Pediatric." The single word hung in the air like a revelation. Dr. Kim's entire demeanor shifted, her casual professionalism replaced by the focused attention of one expert, recognizing another. "Where did you train?" "Hospital Nacional in San Salvador. I completed my residency at Seattle Children's Hospital 12 years ago." Michael felt his understanding of reality shift again. Seattle Children's Hospital, the same hospital where they had taken David the day before. Maria hadn't just worked there. She had trained there, walked those halls as a doctor, made life and death decisions in those same emergency rooms. Dr. Kim was clearly intrigued. Dr. Patricia Morrison was the chief of pediatric surgery then. Did you work under her? I did my surgical rotation with Dr. Morrison, yes. Maria's voice carried a note of fondness mixed with old pain. She was an excellent teacher, very demanding but fair. Pat Morrison is a friend of mine, Dr. Kim said thoughtfully. She's mentioned working with international residents over the years. What was your name then? The question hit Maria like a physical blow. Michael could see her retreat, the professional composure cracking to reveal the vulnerability underneath. It was Dr. Maria Elena Vasquez. Dr. Kim's reaction was immediate and dramatic. Her eyes widened, and she set down her stethoscope with careful precision. Dr. Vasquez. I know that name. Pat Morrison has talked about you for years. She said you were one of the most gifted surgical residents she ever trained. There was some kind of tragedy. You disappeared, went back to El Salvador for family reasons, and never returned to complete your fellowship. Michael watched Maria's face crumble as 15 years of carefully constructed walls came tumbling down. This wasn't just a case of hidden credentials or immigration challenges. This was a story of interrupted dreams, of a brilliant career destroyed by circumstances beyond her control. Dr. Morrison tried to contact you. Dr. Kim continued, unaware of the emotional devastation her words were causing. She had a position waiting for you, a fellowship that would have led to permanent residency status. She said you were the kind of surgeon who comes along once in a generation. Maria's composure finally broke. Tears she had held back for years began streaming down her face, and she turned away, attempting to hide her emotion. But the damage was done. Her true identity, her lost career, her buried dreams, everything, was now exposed in the bright light of Michael's living room. David, sensing the tension but not understanding its source, moved closer to Maria with the instinctive compassion of childhood. Are you sad, Miss Maria? Does your head hurt like mine? Maria knelt down to David's level, wiping her tears and managing a smile for his benefit. I'm okay, menino. Sometimes grown-ups cry when they remember things that make them sad. Dr. Kim, realizing she had stumbled into something deeply personal and painful, spoke with gentle professionalism. Dr. Vasquez, if you ever wanted to explore returning to medicine, there are paths available. The medical community has programs for foreign-trained physicians, especially those with your credentials and experience. It's not possible, Maria said firmly, rising to her feet and retreating behind her professional mask. Too much time has passed, too many complications, but Michael could see that Dr. Kim's words had planted seeds in Maria's mind, sparked hope in places that had been dark for too long. After the doctor left, promising to speak to no one about what she had learned, an uncomfortable silence settled over the house. David, exhausted by the morning's activities, went to his room for a nap, leaving Michael and Maria alone with the weight of revealed truth. Why didn't you tell me? Michael asked, though he immediately recognized the inadequacy of the question. Why would she tell him? He had never asked about her background, never shown interest in her life beyond her ability to maintain his household. He had created an employer-employee relationship so formal and distant that personal revelations would have been inappropriate. What difference would it have made? Maria replied, beginning to clean up from Dr. Kim's visit with mechanical precision. You needed a housekeeper. I needed work. My past doesn't change those facts. But Michael was beginning to understand that her past changed everything. The woman he had employed for 3 years wasn't just overqualified for her position. She was criminally underutilized. A surgeon trained to save children's lives was instead washing his dishes and folding his laundry. The waste of human potential was staggering. What happened? He asked. Why did you leave medicine? Maria's hands stilled, and for a moment Michael thought she would refuse to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. There was violence in my country. Political violence, drug cartels, government corruption. My husband and I were doctors in the public hospital. We treated everyone who came to us regardless of their politics or their ability to pay. Some people didn't like that neutrality. She paused, gathering strength for the rest of the story. One night, armed men came to our house. They were looking for my husband, accusing him of treating rebels. It was a case of mistaken identity, but they didn't care about the truth. They killed Carlos in front of me. Michael felt a chill run through him. He had assumed Maria's immigration story was economic, driven by the desire for better opportunities. He had never considered that she might be a refugee, fleeing violence and death. I was given 24 hours to leave the country, Maria continued. They told me if I stayed, if I tried to report what had happened, I would join my husband. So I ran. I left everything behind, my career, my home, my life. But Dr. Kim said, you had a fellowship waiting, that you could have completed your training here. Maria's laugh was bitter, hollow. I had a fellowship waiting for Dr. Maria Elena Vasquez, a legal resident with proper documentation. I arrived here as Maria Santos, an undocumented immigrant with no way to prove my credentials, no way to practice medicine legally. The woman who had been offered that fellowship effectively died the night my husband was murdered. The scope of her loss was overwhelming. Not just her husband, not just her homeland, but her entire professional identity, her life's work, her purpose. She had been forced to choose between death and professional death, and she had chosen survival. There's more, isn't there? Michael asked gently. Something in her pain seemed deeper than even these devastating losses. Maria was quiet for so long that Michael thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice broke with fresh grief. We had a daughter, Isabella. She was 2 years old when Carlos was killed. I couldn't take her with me. The journey was too dangerous, and I had no idea if I would survive to reach safety. I left her with my sister Carmen, in a village outside the capital. I told myself it would only be temporary, that I would bring her to America once I was established. Michael's breath caught. Maria had a child, a daughter she had been separated from for 15 years. Suddenly her behavior with David made perfect sense. The maternal devotion, the protective instincts, the way she poured herself into caring for another woman's child. Where is she now? He asked, though he suspected the answer would be painful. I don't know. The words came out as a sob. 3 years after I left, Carmen's village was attacked. People fled. Families were separated. Isabella disappeared in the chaos. She was 5 years old. I've spent the last 12 years trying to find her, hiring investigators, checking with refugee organizations, searching databases of missing children. She would be 17 now, if she's still alive. Maria collapsed into a chair, her professional composure completely gone. This was the source of her deep sadness, the weight she carried that went far beyond the loss of career or homeland. She was a mother who had lost her child, who had spent more than a decade not knowing if her daughter was alive or dead. I tell myself that someone found her, that some family took her in and loved her. Maria continued through her tears. But I'll never know. I'll never see her graduate from school, never meet the person she became, never be able to explain why I left her. Every day I wonder if she remembers me, if she thinks I abandoned her, if she's safe somewhere in the world. Michael sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Maria's suffering. He had built his fortune by identifying and solving problems, but this was beyond anything money or influence could fix. A lost child, a destroyed family, a brilliant career reduced to cleaning floors. The injustices were too large and too entrenched for simple solutions. Is that why you're so good with David? He asked, finally. Maria nodded, wiping her eyes. Caring for him is the closest I can come to being a mother again. When I hold him, when I comfort him, when I use my medical knowledge to help him, for those moments, I feel like the person I used to be, the person I was meant to be. The revelation transformed Michael's understanding of his household entirely. For 3 years, a grieving mother had been pouring her frustrated maternal love into caring for his son.
A trained surgeon had been using her skills to keep David healthy and safe, never seeking recognition or additional compensation. She had been protecting and nurturing his child, while her own remained lost to her. That afternoon, while David napped and Maria retreated to her small apartment to recover from the emotional exposure of the morning, Michael found himself in his office making phone calls, not to business associates or potential investors, but to immigration lawyers, refugee organizations, and missing persons databases. For the first time in his adult life, he was using his resources not to build his empire, but to help someone else rebuild theirs. The first call was to his personal attorney, James Richardson, a man who specialized in complex immigration cases for high-net-worth clients. Michael explained the situation, emphasizing the urgency and sensitivity of Maria's circumstances. "This is more complicated than standard immigration issues," Richardson explained.
If she entered the country without documentation, if she's been working under an assumed identity, there are serious legal implications. However, given her professional qualifications and the circumstances of her departure from El Salvador, there may be options for asylum or humanitarian relief. What would it take to get her legal status, to allow her to practice medicine again? Significant documentation, verification of her credentials, background checks, possibly testimony about the violence she fled. It's not impossible, but it's a lengthy process that could take years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. Michael didn't hesitate. Start the process, whatever it costs, whatever it takes. The second call was to Dr. Patricia Morrison at Seattle Children's Hospital. Michael had never met the woman, but Dr. Kim had provided her contact information along with a promise that Dr. Morrison would remember Maria clearly. Dr. Vasquez. Dr. Morrison's voice carried immediate recognition and concern. "I've wondered about her for years. She was extraordinary, one of the most naturally gifted surgeons I've encountered in 4 decades of medicine. She disappeared without explanation during her residency. We held her fellowship position for over a year, hoping she would return." Michael explained the circumstances of Maria's disappearance, the violence that had forced her to flee, the years she had spent working below her qualifications while searching for her lost daughter. Morrison listened with the horrified fascination of someone hearing about a valued colleague's hidden tragedy. If she wanted to return to medicine, if her legal status could be resolved, would there be opportunities for her? Michael asked. "In a heartbeat, Doctor." Morrison replied without hesitation. "The medical community needs surgeons of her caliber, especially those with her cultural competency and language skills. If she could be credentialed again, I would personally ensure she had a position here." The third call was the most difficult. Michael contacted Elena Martinez, a private investigator who specialized in locating missing persons in Central America. He provided what little information Maria had given him about Isabella's disappearance, understanding that the trail was cold and the chances of success were slim. 17 years old now, Martinez repeated, taking notes. "Last seen in a village outside San Salvador 12 years ago. It's a long shot, Mr. Harrison. Children who disappear in that kind of chaos often, well, the outcomes aren't always positive." "I understand the challenges," Michael said. "But I need to know that everything possible is being done. Cost is not a factor." As evening approached, Michael found himself in the unusual position of wanting to share hope with someone whose expectations had been shattered too many times to count. He found Maria in the kitchen, preparing dinner with her usual efficiency, though her eyes were still red from crying. "I made some phone calls today," he said, without preamble, "about your legal status, about your medical credentials, about Isabella." Maria's hand stilled, and she turned to face him with a mixture of hope and wariness. "Mr. Harrison, I appreciate your concern, but I've retained an immigration attorney," he continued. "One of the best in the country. He thinks there are viable paths to legal residency, possibly even citizenship, given your circumstances and qualifications. The legal fees alone would be already covered. Dr. Morrison at Seattle Children's Hospital remembers you clearly. She said if your legal status could be resolved, you would have a position waiting for you. Maria leaned against the counter, overwhelmed. It's been 15 years. My hands, my knowledge, everything would need to be updated, recertified, all manageable problems with manageable solutions. Michael paused, watching her face carefully. I also hired an investigator to look for Isabella. I know the chances are small, but I need to know that someone is searching. This was too much for Maria to process. For 15 years, she had survived by lowering her expectations, by accepting that her old life was gone forever, by finding small satisfactions in small roles. The possibility that her lost career could be recovered, that her daughter might be found, was almost too large to contemplate. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, tears starting again. "I'm just your housekeeper." "No," Michael said firmly. "You're not just my housekeeper. You're a doctor who saved my son's life. You're a mother who lost everything and still found a way to love another child. You're someone who deserves to have her life back." The conversation was interrupted by David's voice calling from upstairs. He had woken from his nap disoriented and frightened, a common side effect of his concussion. Maria immediately moved toward the stairs, her maternal instincts overriding everything else, but Michael caught her arm gently. "Let me," he said. "You've been taking care of him for 3 years. Maybe it's time I learned how." Michael climbed the stairs to his son's room, finding David sitting up in bed, confusion and fear clouding his features. For the first time, Michael sat on the edge of the bed and pulled his son into his arms, offering the kind of physical comfort he had always left to others. "It's okay," he murmured, the words feeling foreign but necessary. "You're safe. I'm here." David relaxed against his father's chest, and Michael realized how much he had been missing by maintaining emotional distance. Protecting himself from potential loss had also protected him from connection, from the daily joy of being needed by someone who loved him unconditionally. "Is Miss Maria okay?" David asked. "She seemed really sad today." "She's been sad for a long time," Michael answered honestly. "But maybe things are going to get better for her. Because she's really a doctor, like the ones at the hospital. Because she's really a doctor, and because she deserves to be happy." David considered this with the seriousness only children bring to important questions. "Can she still take care of me while she's being a doctor again?" Michael smiled, understanding that his son had grasped something essential about their situation. Maria's return to medicine didn't have to mean the end of her relationship with David. If anything, it might strengthen their bond by allowing her to be fully herself again. "We'll figure that out together," Michael promised. That evening, after David was asleep and the house was quiet, Michael found himself on his back deck, looking out at the city lights and thinking about the day's revelations. His orderly world had been turned upside down by a simple accident and a moment of truth, but instead of feeling disrupted, he felt energized in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Maria joined him on the deck, bringing 2 cups of coffee, a small gesture that felt significant in light of their changed relationship. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both processing the day's emotional upheavals. "Are you serious about helping me?" Maria asked finally. "About the legal issues, the medical licensing, the search for Isabella?" "Completely serious," Michael replied. "I have resources I've never used for anything meaningful. I'd like to change that. It could take years. It might not work at all. Then we'll try for years. And if it doesn't work, at least we'll know we tried everything." Maria was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke her voice was stronger than it had been all day. "I need to tell you something else. Something I've never told anyone since I came to this country." Michael waited, sensing that whatever she was about to reveal would be significant. "The night Carlos was killed, the night I had to leave everything behind, I was 3 months pregnant." The words hit Michael like a physical blow. A second child, lost in the chaos of violence and flight. The scope of Maria's losses expanded again, encompassing not just Isabella and Carlos, but an unborn child who had died with her old life. "I miscarried during the crossing," Maria continued,
her voice steady but filled with old grief. The stress, the conditions, the fear, my body couldn't sustain the pregnancy. I lost my husband, my daughter, my career, my country, and my unborn child all within a matter of weeks. Michael felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of her survival. How did someone endure such devastating losses and continue living? How did they find the strength to care for other people's children when their own had been taken from them? I'm telling you this because I need you to understand what you're offering to help me recover. It's not just a career or legal status. It's my identity as a mother, as a healer, as a person who used to save lives instead of just surviving day to day. I understand, Michael said, though he knew his understanding was limited by his own privileged experience. And I'm committed to helping you get back everything that was taken from you. As they sat together in the darkness, both lost in their own thoughts, neither of them could have predicted that their conversation was being overheard. In the shadows at the edge of the property, a figure with a camera and recording equipment was documenting everything, gathering information that would soon be sold to the highest bidder. The immigration attorney Michael had contacted that day was excellent at his job, but he was also ambitious and not particularly discreet. Word had already begun to spread through Seattle's legal community about the high-profile client seeking help for an undocumented immigrant with an interesting medical background. In a city where information was currency, Maria's story was about to become valuable to people with very different agendas than Michael's humanitarian impulses. But for now, in the quiet of the evening, two people who had been virtual strangers that morning were beginning to understand that their lives had become inextricably connected. Michael had found a purpose beyond accumulating wealth, and Maria had found someone willing to fight for her second chance. Neither of them realized that their biggest challenges lay ahead, that powerful forces would soon emerge to threaten everything they were trying to build. The investigation into Maria's background would uncover not just her tragic personal history, but connections to political figures and criminal organizations that had reasons to keep her buried in obscurity. The search for Isabella would lead to discoveries that would endanger everyone involved. And Michael's decision to help Maria would attract attention from people who viewed her knowledge and connections as threats to be eliminated. For tonight, though, there was hope. For the first time in 15 years, Maria allowed herself to believe that she might reclaim her life, find her daughter, and return to the work she was born to do. For Michael, there was the satisfaction of using his resources for something that mattered more than quarterly profits. And for David, sleeping peacefully upstairs, there was the security of being loved by two people who would move heaven and earth to protect him. The quiet conversation on the deck marked the end of their old relationship and the beginning of something unprecedented. Employer and employee had been transformed into allies, partners in a mission that would test every limit of courage, resources, and determination they possessed. The accident that had revealed Maria's true identity was only the first domino to fall in a chain reaction that would ultimately reshape all their lives. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks later, on a grey Tuesday morning that started like any other. Michael was reviewing quarterly projections when his personal assistant Sarah knocked on his office door with an expression that immediately put him on alert. "There's a gentleman here to see you," she said carefully. "He says it's about an urgent matter regarding your household staff. He won't give his name, but he has government identification." Michael felt a chill run down his spine. In the 3 weeks since Maria's revelation and his commitment to help her, the immigration attorney had warned him that government attention was possible, but Michael had assumed any official interest would come through proper legal channels. The man who entered Michael's office was everything a federal agent should be: unremarkable in the most deliberate way possible. Average height, generic features, clothing that suggested government work without advertising any specific agency. His eyes, however, were sharp and calculating, missing nothing as they swept the room. "Mr. Harrison, thank you for seeing me without an appointment. Agent David Morales, Immigration and Customs Enforcement." He showed identification that looked authentic, though Michael noticed he palmed it too quickly for careful examination. I understand you've recently retained legal counsel for an undocumented employee. Michael's training in corporate negotiations kicked in immediately. Never admit anything, never volunteer information, never let them see weakness. I'm not sure what you're referring to, Agent Morales. Perhaps you could be more specific about the purpose of your visit. Morales smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Maria Santos, currently employed as your housekeeper, previously known as Dr. Maria Elena Vasquez, we have reason to believe she may be connected to criminal activities that pose a national security risk. The words hit Michael like physical blows. Criminal activities, national security risk.
These weren't immigration violations or documentation issues. This was something far more serious and dangerous. I think there's been some mistake, Michael said carefully. Miss Santos is a valued employee who has worked for my family for 3 years without incident. She has no criminal history that I'm aware of. What you're aware of may be incomplete, Mr. Harrison. Morales opened a manila folder and placed several photographs on Michael's desk. They showed Maria in various locations around Seattle, some clearly taken with telephoto lenses from considerable distances. We've been monitoring her activities since her employer began making inquiries about her legal status. Michael stared at the surveillance photos with growing anger and alarm. Someone had been watching Maria, photographing her daily routine, treating her like a criminal under investigation. The invasion of privacy was staggering, but more concerning was what it implied about the scope of whatever case they were building. Dr. Vasquez fled El Salvador under suspicious circumstances, Morales continued, his tone suggesting he was reading from a prepared script. Her husband was involved with rebel groups that had connections to drug trafficking organizations. She may have been privy to financial information that could compromise ongoing operations. Her husband was a doctor who was murdered for treating patients regardless of their politics, Michael said firmly. She's a refugee, not a criminal. According to her story, yes. But refugees sometimes carry information that makes them valuable to people who don't have America's best interests at heart. We need to speak with her about what she might know, what connections she might still have. Michael recognized a fishing expedition when he saw one. Morales was making vague accusations without providing specific charges, hoping to pressure Michael into cooperation. The strategy might have worked if Michael hadn't spent decades dealing with corporate espionage and hostile takeovers. If you have specific charges against Miss Santos, I assume you'll pursue them through proper legal channels, Michael said. If you don't, I don't see what assistance I can provide. Morales gathered his photographs with deliberate slowness. Mr. Harrison, you're a respected businessman with a reputation to protect. Association with individuals under federal investigation can be damaging to corporate relationships, government contracts, public perception. It would be unfortunate if your charitable impulses resulted in unintended consequences. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Cooperate or face the possibility that his business empire would become collateral damage in whatever operation they were conducting. Michael had faced similar pressure tactics before, usually from competitors trying to gain negotiating advantages. I appreciate your concern for my business interests, Michael replied evenly. I'm confident that any association with Miss Santos will reflect positively on my character and judgment. After Morales left, Michael immediately called James Richardson, his immigration attorney. The conversation that followed was deeply troubling. ICE doesn't usually send agents for casual conversations, Richardson said grimly. If they're making national security claims, this goes beyond standard immigration enforcement. Someone wants Maria badly enough to fabricate serious charges. What kind of charges? Hard to say without seeing their evidence, but the mention of drug trafficking and rebel connections suggests they're trying to build a terrorism or organized crime case. These are charges that can be used to hold someone indefinitely without trial, to justify extraordinary surveillance and detention measures. Michael felt the walls closing in. Is this about her medical knowledge? Could someone be trying to silence her because of what she witnessed in El Salvador? It's possible, Medical personnel in conflict zones often see things that powerful people prefer to keep hidden. If Maria treated victims of government violence, if she has knowledge of who was responsible for atrocities, that information could be incredibly valuable to the right people. The implications were staggering. Maria's medical expertise, her first-hand knowledge of violence perpetrated by government forces and their allies, could be evidence in war crimes cases, human rights investigations, or corruption prosecutions. People with billions of dollars and decades of criminal activity at stake would go to extraordinary lengths to prevent such testimony from becoming public. "What do we do?" Michael asked. "Very carefully, very quietly, we accelerate everything. The longer Maria remains in legal limbo, the more vulnerable she becomes to pressure tactics or worse. I'm going to expedite her asylum application, but we need to be prepared for escalated government attention." That evening, Michael found himself in the position of delivering terrifying news to someone who had already endured more than her share of terror. Maria listened to his account of Agent Morales's visit with the stillness of someone who had learned to absorb shock without visible reaction. "They think I'm connected to the people who killed my husband," she said finally, her voice hollow with disbelief. "It's a pretext," Michael assured her. "Someone wants to discredit you to make it impossible for you to tell your story or pursue legal status. The question is, who benefits from keeping you silent?" Maria was quiet for a long moment, her mind working through possibilities that Michael couldn't even imagine. When she spoke, her voice carried a new edge of fear. The men who killed Carlos weren't just random paramilitaries. They were connected to government officials, to people who were profiting from the violence. "If I were to testify about what I saw, about the patients I treated, it could expose corruption that goes to the highest levels." "What did you see?" "Military officers bringing wounded fighters for treatment off the books. Government officials' children receiving medical care paid for with funds that should have gone to public health programs. Evidence of systematic torture, execution orders signed by people who were probably still in power." Michael understood now why someone would go to great lengths to keep Maria from returning to medicine, from gaining the credibility and platform that would come with restored professional status. She wasn't just a refugee seeking a better life. She was a potential witness to war crimes and corruption. The next morning brought news that transformed concern into crisis. Elena Martinez, the private investigator Michael had hired to search for Isabella, called with information that changed everything. "I found something," Martinez said without preamble. "It's not what you were hoping for, but it's significant. Isabella Vasquez didn't disappear randomly during the village attack. She was specifically taken." Michael felt his blood turn to ice. "Taken by whom?" "A private security company with connections to American military contractors. They were operating in El Salvador during that period, ostensibly providing protection for international aid organizations. But they also ran a side business in intelligence gathering, kidnapping and human trafficking." The words hit Michael like a series of physical blows. Isabella hadn't simply been lost in the chaos of violence. She had been deliberately separated from her family by people who specialized in making children disappear. "Do you know where she is now?" "That's where it gets complicated. The security company was disbanded after congressional investigations into their Central American operations. Most of their personnel scattered to other contractors or government agencies, but I have a lead on one of their former operatives who might have information about what happened to the children they took." Michael's mind was racing. If Isabella had been taken by American contractors, if she had been trafficked or disappeared by people with government connections, then Maria's story wasn't just about immigration or refugee status. It was about crimes committed by Americans against foreign nationals, crimes that could expose corruption at the highest levels of government and military contracting. "How dangerous is this investigation?" Michael asked. "Very. The people involved have killed to protect their secrets before. If they think we're getting close to finding Isabella, they'll do whatever it takes to stop us." Michael hung up the phone with a growing sense of dread. The forces arrayed against Maria weren't just bureaucratic obstacles or immigration enforcement. They were people who had committed serious crimes and would commit more to keep them hidden. That afternoon, while Michael was meeting with Richardson to discuss accelerated legal strategies, disaster struck. David called from school, his voice high with panic. "Dad, there are police cars at our house, lots of them. The neighbors are standing outside watching. I think something bad happened." Michael's heart stopped. He told David to stay exactly where he was, called his driver, and raced home to find his worst fears realized. 3 ICE vehicles were parked in his circular drive, and federal agents were escorting Maria toward one of them in handcuffs. Michael burst from his car as the agents were loading Maria into the back of a van. "What are the charges?" he demanded. "Where are you taking her?" Agent Morales emerged from the house carrying boxes of Maria's personal belongings. "Dr. Vasquez is being detained on suspicion of providing material support to terrorist organizations. She'll be held pending investigation." "That's completely fabricated," Michael said, his voice rising. "You know these charges are false. What we know is that Dr. Vasquez has connections to individuals and organizations that pose a threat to national security. Until we can determine the extent of those connections, she'll remain in federal custody." Michael watched helplessly as the van carrying Maria disappeared down his driveway. The woman who had saved his son's life, who had cared for his family with devotion and skill, who had already lost everything once before, was being taken away on charges he knew were completely fabricated. The next few hours were a blur of desperate phone calls and emergency meetings. Richardson was already working on habeas corpus petitions and detention hearings, but the federal authorities were claiming national security exceptions that could keep Maria in custody indefinitely without trial. "They're holding her at a private detention facility," Richardson reported grimly. "No visitors allowed, no communication with the outside world. The charges are vague enough that they can justify almost any level of restriction." "How is this possible in America?" Michael demanded. "Post 9/11 legislation gives the government extraordinary powers when they claim national security concerns. As long as they can argue that Maria might have information relevant to terrorist activities, they can hold her indefinitely." But Michael suspected this wasn't really about terrorism or national security. This was about silencing a witness, preventing her from testifying about crimes committed by Americans in El Salvador, and ensuring that her search for Isabella never succeeded. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Morrison called Michael that evening with news that would change everything. "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding Dr. Vasquez," she said. "Something about her situation reminded me of other cases I've encountered over the years. Medical personnel who fled conflicts and then faced mysterious legal troubles when they tried to rebuild their lives here. You think this has happened before? I think there's a pattern. Doctors, nurses, aid workers who witnessed atrocities committed by American contractors or government personnel overseas. They come here seeking asylum, and they face orchestrated campaigns to discredit them, deport them, or silence them permanently." Dr. Morrison had been in contact with a congressional staffer who specialized in oversight of military contractors. The staffer, Amanda Chen, had been investigating American security companies operating in Central America during the period when Maria fled El Salvador. "Dr. Morrison told me about your employee's situation," Chen said when Michael reached her. "If she's who I think she is, she may be one of the most important witnesses we've been trying to locate for years." "Witness to what?" "War crimes, human trafficking, systematic torture and execution of civilians by American contractors working with corrupt government forces. We have documentation of these activities, but we've been missing first-hand testimony from medical personnel who treated the victims." Chen explained that her investigation had uncovered evidence of a systematic campaign to silence witnesses to American involvement in Central American violence.
Medical professionals, aid workers and journalists who had witnessed atrocities were being targeted for immigration enforcement, prosecuted on fabricated charges, or simply disappeared. Dr. Vasquez's husband was killed not because he treated rebels but because he treated victims of American contractor violence. She fled not because of political persecution, but because she had evidence that could expose war crimes committed by Americans. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. Maria wasn't just a refugee seeking a better life. She was a key witness in a case that could expose decades of American involvement in human rights violations. What about her daughter? Michael asked. We have evidence that Isabella was taken by American contractors. Chen's silence was telling. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with implication. Children of witnesses have been used as leverage before.
Taking someone's child ensures their silence, gives you permanent control over their behavior. Michael felt sick. Isabella hadn't just been lost in the chaos of violence. She had been deliberately taken to ensure Maria's silence, to guarantee that she would never speak publicly about what she had witnessed. If we can prove Isabella was taken by American contractors, if we can locate her, would that be enough to expose this conspiracy? It would be a start, but the people involved have unlimited resources and no conscience about eliminating threats. If they think we're getting close to the truth, they'll escalate their response. Michael understood what Chen was telling him. Pursuing justice for Maria and searching for Isabella wouldn't just be legally challenging, it would be physically dangerous for everyone involved. But that night, as Michael sat in his empty house missing the quiet presence of the woman who had made it a home, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He was going to find Isabella, expose the truth about what had happened to her family, and bring Maria home regardless of the personal cost. The first step was breaking Maria out of detention, a plan so audacious that Richardson initially refused to discuss it. But Michael had advantages that most people in similar situations lacked: unlimited financial resources, connections throughout the business and political communities, and a willingness to risk everything for justice. The plan that emerged was complex, dangerous, and probably illegal. It would require coordination between congressional investigators, sympathetic federal agents, international human rights organizations, and private security professionals willing to operate in gray areas of the law. Elena Martinez had located the former contractor who might have information about Isabella's whereabouts. The man, Robert Stevens, was living under an assumed identity in Costa Rica, apparently hiding from both his former employers and the authorities investigating his activities. Stevens was involved in the child trafficking operation, Martinez reported. He kept records of what happened to the children they took, partly for blackmail purposes and partly because he's not entirely stable. He's willing to talk, but only in person, only in a secure location. Michael made arrangements to fly to Costa Rica, despite warnings from Richardson and Chen that leaving the country would make him a target for the same forces that had taken Maria. But Stevens' information might be the key to locating Isabella and exposing the conspiracy that had destroyed her family. The meeting with Stevens took place in a secure house outside San Jose, arranged by Martinez through contacts in the international investigation community. Stevens was a broken man, haunted by decades of violence and criminality, but his information was detailed and credible. We took dozens of children during the Central American operations, he said, his voice flat with exhaustion. Most were sold to adoption agencies that didn't ask questions. Some went to families with government connections who wanted to appear charitable. A few were kept for leverage against their parents. What about Isabella Vasquez? Stevens consulted handwritten notes that he had apparently carried for years. Age 5, taken from a village outside San Salvador in 2012. She was specifically requested by a family in Texas. Military contractor family with State Department connections. They adopted her legally through a private agency that specialized in placing refugee children. Michael felt a surge of hope and terror. Isabella was alive, had been raised by an American family, was probably living somewhere in Texas under a different name. But she had been deliberately separated from her mother as part of a systematic campaign to silence witnesses to war crimes. Do you have names? Locations. Stevens provided detailed information about the adoptive family, the agencies involved, and the officials who had facilitated the illegal adoption. It was enough to locate Isabella, but approaching her would be incredibly dangerous for everyone involved. The people who arranged this adoption have killed to protect their secrets, Stevens warned. If they think Isabella might be reunited with her mother, if they think she might learn the truth about her background, they'll eliminate the threat permanently. Michael returned to Seattle with information that could reunite Maria with her daughter, but using it would put all of them in mortal danger. The forces that had separated them were still active, still powerful, and still willing to commit murder to protect their secrets. Meanwhile, Maria remained in federal detention, held on charges that everyone knew were fabricated, but that served their purpose of keeping her silenced and isolated. The legal challenges Richardson was mounting faced bureaucratic obstacles that seemed designed to delay resolution indefinitely. The solution came from Amanda Chen, whose congressional investigation had reached the point where dramatic action was not just possible but necessary. If Maria could be brought before a congressional committee as a protected witness, if her testimony could be taken under oath and made public, it would be much harder for her enemies to silence her permanently. "We can arrange for her temporary release to testify," Chen explained. "Congressional subpoena power trumps most federal detention orders, especially when national security oversight is involved, but we'll only get one chance. Once she testifies, once her story becomes public, there's no taking it back." The plan required precise timing and absolute secrecy. Maria would be brought before the committee under heavy security, would provide detailed testimony about American contractor involvement in war crimes, and would publicly demand assistance in locating her daughter. The testimony would be broadcast nationally, making it impossible for the government to simply make her disappear. But first they needed to ensure Isabella's safety. If her adoptive family was connected to the people who had taken her, if they were part of the conspiracy to silence Maria, then approaching her without careful preparation could result in her disappearance or worse. Michael used his business connections to hire the best private security firm in the country, specialists in protecting whistleblowers and witnesses in high-stakes cases. They would locate Isabella, verify her identity, and ensure her safety before Maria's testimony made their connection public. The final phase of the operation began on a humid Thursday morning in Houston, where Isabella Vasquez was living under the name Rebecca Williams with an adoptive family connected to military contracting. She was 17 years old, a senior in high school, an honor student who spoke fluent English and had no memory of her early childhood in El Salvador. The private security team, working with sympathetic federal agents from Chen's congressional investigation, approached the Williams family with evidence of Isabella's true identity and the circumstances of her adoption. The confrontation was explosive. Mr. Williams, a former military contractor who had been involved in the original operations in El Salvador, initially denied everything, but faced with documented evidence of his involvement in child trafficking, he broke down and confessed to his role in the conspiracy. "We were told she was an orphan," he claimed. "We were told her parents were dead, that we were giving her a better life. But the investigation revealed that Williams had known exactly who Isabella was and why she had been taken. He had been paid handsomely for adopting her, had been given government contracts in exchange for his silence, and had been part of the systematic effort to keep her separated from her mother." Isabella's reaction to learning the truth about her identity was initially one of disbelief and anger. She had lived her entire conscious life, believing she was Rebecca Williams, believing her adoptive parents had rescued her from poverty and violence. Learning that she had been deliberately stolen from her mother, that her entire life had been built on a lie, was devastating. But when she saw photographs of Maria,
when she heard recordings of her mother's voice speaking in Spanish, something deep in her memory stirred. Fragments of early childhood, suppressed by trauma and time, began to surface. She remembered being held by a woman who smelled like flowers, remembered a voice singing lullabies in Spanish, remembered feeling safe and loved. The reunion was arranged for the day of Maria's congressional testimony in a secure room at the Capitol building. Maria, temporarily released from detention under heavy guard, walked into a room where her 17-year-old daughter was waiting. Isabella looked exactly like Maria had at that age, tall, graceful, with the same intelligent eyes and determined chin. But she also looked like a young woman who had been raised in privilege, educated in American schools, shaped by experiences completely different from her mother's expectations. The first moments were awkward, tentative. Isabella spoke to her mother in English, then switched to halting Spanish when Maria responded in her native language. They were strangers who shared blood and history but not culture or experience. "I remember you," Isabella said finally, her voice breaking. "I remember you singing to me. I remember feeling safe." Maria reached out tentatively, and Isabella allowed herself to be embraced by the mother she had been stolen from 15 years earlier. They held each other and cried, grieving for the lost years, the missed milestones, the relationship that had been destroyed by people who viewed human lives as acceptable casualties in their pursuit of power and profit. 2 hours later, Maria walked into a congressional hearing room and provided testimony that would change everything. Under oath, before a national television audience, she detailed American contractor involvement in war crimes, human trafficking, and systematic violence against civilians in El Salvador. She described watching government officials torture prisoners, treating victims of execution squads, and witnessing the systematic corruption that had turned American foreign aid into a slush fund for criminal enterprises. She named names, provided dates, and offered to testify in criminal proceedings against the people responsible. Most importantly, she demanded justice for the children who had been taken from their families, separated from their cultures, and used as leverage to silence witnesses to atrocities. Isabella sat in the gallery, listening to her mother describe the violence that had destroyed their family and the systematic campaign that had kept them apart. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Within hours of Maria's testimony, federal agents were arresting current and former military contractors, government officials who had facilitated the conspiracy, and private adoption agencies that had participated in child trafficking operations. The charges against Maria were dropped immediately, her detention declared unlawful, and her asylum application approved on an emergency basis. Patricia Morrison called before the hearing was even finished, offering Maria a position at Seattle Children's Hospital and assistance with medical license restoration. But the victory came with a cost. The people Maria had exposed weren't going to accept defeat quietly. That night, Michael's security team intercepted communications, suggesting that contracted killers had been hired to eliminate both Maria and Isabella before they could provide additional testimony. The next few months were a tense period of living under federal protection, while the full scope of the conspiracy was investigated and prosecuted. Maria and Isabella lived in a secure facility, getting to know each other again while federal agents dismantled the network that had destroyed their family. Isabella struggled with her identity, torn between the American life she had known and the Salvadoran heritage that had been stolen from her. She was angry at everyone, her adoptive parents for lying to her, the government for allowing it to happen, even Maria for not finding her sooner. But slowly, carefully, they rebuilt their relationship. Maria helped Isabella understand the circumstances that had forced their separation, while Isabella helped Maria understand the person she had become during their years apart. They were learning to be mother and daughter again, to be a family despite the forces that had tried to keep them apart. Michael's role in their reunion made him an honorary member of their reconstructed family. David, who had been living with the trauma of watching Maria's arrest, was overjoyed to have her back in their lives. The four of them formed an unconventional family unit, bound together by shared trauma and mutual devotion. The legal proceedings against the conspiracy took 2 years to complete, resulting in dozens of convictions and the exposure of systematic corruption that reached the highest levels of government and military contracting. Maria's testimony was crucial to securing justice for hundreds of families who had been destroyed by American involvement in Central American violence. Dr. Morrison was true to her word. Maria returned to Seattle Children's Hospital as a pediatric surgeon, her skills intact despite 15 years away from operating rooms. She specialized in treating refugee children, using her experience to provide not just medical care but cultural understanding to families traumatized by violence and displacement. Isabella finished high school in Seattle, choosing to live with Maria and rediscover her Salvadoran identity while pursuing her education. She struggled with trust issues and identity confusion, but she was alive, safe, and reunited with the mother who had never stopped searching for her. Michael found his purpose in using his wealth and influence to support other families separated by violence and corruption. He established a foundation dedicated to locating missing children, supporting refugee families, and exposing government contractors who committed crimes against civilians. The mansion that had once been a symbol of isolated wealth became a gathering place for people working toward justice. Maria's small apartment above the garage was converted into a permanent residence where she and Isabella could rebuild their relationship in safety and comfort. David grew up understanding that families come in many forms, that love transcends blood relationships, and that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose to fight for justice. He remained close to both Maria and Isabella, considering them family in every way that mattered. The story ended not with perfect resolution, but with hope. Maria had reclaimed her identity as a doctor and a mother, Isabella had found her way back to her heritage and her family, and Michael had discovered that true wealth comes from using resources to help others reclaim their own stolen lives. They couldn't undo the years of separation, couldn't resurrect the husband and father who had been murdered, couldn't erase the trauma they had all endured, but they had survived, found each other, and built something beautiful from the wreckage of their individual tragedies. Most importantly, they had exposed and dismantled a conspiracy that had destroyed countless other families. Their victory wouldn't bring back everyone who had been lost, but it might prevent future families from suffering the same devastating separations. In the end, the woman Michael had thought was just his housekeeper had taught him the most important lesson of his life, that the measure of a person's worth isn't found in their job title or bank account, but in their willingness to fight for justice, to protect those who cannot protect themselves, and to never stop believing that even the most devastating losses can be overcome through courage, determination, and love. 5 years later, the Harrison Foundation's annual gala filled the Seattle Convention Center with hundreds of supporters. Michael stood at the podium, looking out at an audience that included government officials, medical professionals, and families whose lives had been transformed by their work reuniting separated children with their parents. Maria Vasquez, now chief of pediatric surgery at Seattle Children's Hospital, sat at the head table with her daughter Isabella, who had just graduated from medical school and was beginning her own residency in emergency medicine. The young woman who had been stolen from her mother was now following in her footsteps, determined to heal the wounds that violence and corruption had inflicted on other families. David Harrison, now 13 and fluent in Spanish, served as the evening's interpreter for families still learning English. The shy boy who had once needed protection had grown into a confident young man who understood that true strength came from helping others find theirs. Michael's speech was brief and heartfelt. When a child is hurt, we don't ask about their documentation status or their parents' history, we simply heal. Dr. Vasquez taught me that healing extends far beyond medicine. Sometimes it means reuniting families. Sometimes it means exposing injustice. Sometimes it means giving someone a second chance to reclaim their stolen life. As the evening wound down, Maria found Michael on the convention center's balcony, looking out at the city lights. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if David hadn't had that accident?" she asked. Michael considered the question. "I think we would have continued living parallel lives in the same house, never really knowing each other. Sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal who people really are." And sometimes, Maria added, it takes someone willing to see beyond job titles and assumptions to recognize that everyone has a story worth knowing. Isabella joined them on the balcony, still wearing her medical school graduation pin. "The families we helped tonight," she said, "they remind me that our story isn't unique. There are thousands of children separated from their parents by violence, corruption, and indifference. But there are also people like you, Michael, willing to fight for justice even when it's dangerous." David appeared in the doorway, having finished his interpreting duties for the evening. "Mom says we're having ice cream when we get home," he announced, using the title he had naturally adopted for Maria years earlier. "Did she specify what kind?" Michael asked with mock seriousness. "The good kind," David replied with a grin, "the kind that comes in containers bigger than my head." As they prepared to leave, Michael reflected on the transformation that had begun with a simple accident and led to the exposure of international corruption, the reunification of a family, and the creation of a foundation that had helped hundreds of other families find their way back to each other. The woman he had once known only as a quiet housekeeper had become one of the most respected pediatric surgeons on the West Coast. The daughter who had been stolen and hidden had become a doctor dedicated to treating victims of violence. The man who had built his identity around accumulating wealth had learned that the greatest fortune was the one measured in lives saved and families reunited. Their unconventional family walked through the Seattle night toward home, four people whose lives had been forever changed by choosing to see each other, not as employer and employee, not as citizen and immigrant, not as stranger and family, but simply as human beings worthy of love, respect, and the chance to heal from whatever had broken them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.